Hey, it's Mark from MacBreak Studio. So as you can see, we've got some beautiful clouds here, and I've been enjoying shooting some time-lapse photography. So I thought today on MacBreak Studio, I'd show you my process that I've been using to shoot and edit these time lapses using Final Cut Pro 10. Let's jump in. So I'm shooting these time lapses with this Sony a7R IV, which is a great stills camera. It's 61 megapixels, which is actually too much for what we're doing here. And it's kind of a long story why I have this camera. I ordered the a7 S3, but didn't arrive in time for me to take this trip. So I got this camera kind of as a placeholder, because all my lenses are for the a7 S3. They're really for video. But anyway, so I'm shooting the a7R IV. I'm using this 24 to 105 f4 Sony G lens all the way at 105, and it has so much resolution it allows me to punch in, which is really great. I also have a polar circular polarizing filter on the front of it. And then what I do for settings for clouds that I found works well is my shooting interval I set for 5 seconds, and this camera has an interval shooting function built right into it, so I don't need a separate device for it. 5 seconds, I do 720 shots. If you do the math on that, that means shooting for an hour. And I find an hour I get a good animation without a lot of light changing, and seems to work pretty well. For me, I've done more than that as well, but this seems pretty good. I've done this several times now. And then for the file format, I could shoot raw. They're 61 megabytes each. They're huge. So if I've got 721 of them, that's a lot of data. And I don't actually need that much. I don't need to punch in that much. So I've switched to shooting JPEG. They're 22 megabytes. They're about 6K. And then it's plenty for me to either do a move on or just punch in if I'm a little too wide at 105, because that's the longest lens that I have. And that's my basic camera setup. I also shoot in manual because I don't want the camera automatically adjusting ISO or exposure, f-stop, shutter speed, anything. And if there's light change, I'll deal with that in the color correction phase. So when I'm done shooting, I copy all of those files. You can see here there's 720 of them to a folder on a fast drive, on a little Samsung portable drive. And you could import them directly into Final Cut, and in doing so, copy them to a location in the library, out of the library. I prefer this method because I'm going to delete these files when I'm done. I'm doing a lot of this, and I just don't need thousands of these 5 megabyte images sticking around, and I'll show you why in a moment. So once I've copied them over, I then import them into Final Cut, but I'm using leave in place because I already have them sitting in a folder. So that happens very, very quickly. I then create a new custom project that exactly matches the frame size of those stills. I have one still selected here so you can see its frame size or its resolution here in the inspector, and I just look at that while I type in these values here. And then I'm also working at 24p here. Once I've done that, I select all of those images, Command A. I throw them in the timeline by tapping E. I hit Command 2 to select the timeline, Command A to select all the clips, Control D to set the duration, and then type 1 Enter, and doing so makes every image 1 frame long. Then I press Shift Z to fit them all into the window, and I usually scrub through them to check them out. Not necessary, but I like to check them out and make sure the first couple aren't some test photos or something like that. And then I export it. And I choose to export this as ProRes LT because I feel like the quality is high enough and it keeps the file size down. I really like ProRes LT to do this with. Once I've exported that, I select all of these clips in the timeline again, Command A, and I hit delete. I get rid of them. I then select all the clips in the browser and press Command delete. Not delete because that will just reject them, but Command delete to delete them out of the library completely. And this says, and I'll get a warning, I'm moving them to the trash. Remember, Final Cut will never touch external media, so it will remove them from the library here, but I didn't import them inside the library, so they'll still exist on the hard drive. I do then go delete them off the hard drive as well because I have this ProRes LT movie that basically is my master. So before I bring that movie back in, I modify the settings on this now empty project to match my output resolution, 1920 by 1080 at 24p. Then I import that exported ProRes LT movie. I put in the timeline, and it will show render dots because remember, it's larger. If you look at the resolution, at the top corner, you can see it's much, much larger than 1920 by 1080. The nice thing about that is I can now resize this. I can punch in quite a bit. In this case, I don't need a ton, but I can punch in quite a bit, both at the beginning, or I could do a move on it over the course of the entire time lapse. From there, I turn my attention to color correction. I like to handle dynamic range and saturation separately here. So first, I like to add a color curves correction, and I work with the luma curve in order to really increase the dynamic range. From there, I'll add a color wheels correction, and my goal here is to bring some saturation back into the image, but not in the highlights or shadows. So I'll pump up the saturation in the midtones, but then I'll bring it down in both the shadows and the highlights so that my bright whites, the clouds themselves, the brightest part of the clouds, don't get tinted with any color, as well as the shadows shouldn't get tinted with color. If the light is changing over the course of the shot, in this case it's 1 hour long or 30 seconds of video, I'll set keyframes for both my corrections at the start of the clip, then move the play to the end of the clip and adjust my corrections. I didn't do it here, but sometimes I'll use the Ken Burns effect to then do a little push on the movie. And once I'm happy, I'll export it for uploading to the web. What do you think? What's your process? Leave us a comment below. We'll see you next time here on MacBreak Studio.